Reanimate's now sponsored by Diet Coke. The worst sponsor you could have.
That'd be fucking great. Oh my god, imagine how nice your house would be.
Financially, but ethically. Hello, Martin Dunlop. Welcome to Reanimates, a podcast. It's a strange and wondrous journey through the filmography of Jeffrey Combs. Don't you think that sounds like a good idea, Martin Dunlop?
Is Jeffrey Combs paying you to do this?
No, I actually hope he doesn't listen to it. I don't know. I think that I would be too self-conscious to talk about someone if I knew they were listening.
Yeah, I don't think he doesn't strike me as the kind of man who would want to listen to a whole podcast about himself. He seems like he's a real hard, diligent worker.
Well, yeah, but if you knew there was a whole podcast about you, wouldn't you be a little curious?
Well, I don't think I would be curious if it was going to go into my personal life and uncover things.
I'm not going to do any digging. I'm sure Jeffrey Combs is a perfectly nice man.
Yeah, see, I actually don't. I'm now realising, outside of knowing that he was friends with Stuart Gordon, who made Reanimator and came up through the New York theatre scene, I guess. I don't actually know anything about him, really. Yeah, that seems bad.
No, he's had a pretty normal life from what I've gathered, from interviews and stuff. Nothing controversial's come out.
Well,
yet.
Yeah, see, now I do want to investigate further, and this is how we found out that he's an incredible actor and also, secretly a serial killer or something. Well,
yeah, it's always the quiet ones you got to watch out for. Speaking of, that's a terrible tangent.
No, that's a good tangent.
Oh, really? It doesn't...
Speaking of the quiet ones, here is a very good film from the 90s that you haven't heard of.
Yeah, that's true. So today we're doing Necronomicon... sometimes called Necronomicon Book of the Dead. It's from 1993. It is a sort of anthology.
It is an anthology.
Yes.
This is an anthology. A portmanteau.
Portmanteau.
It's a bag.
Yeah.
It's an overnight bag.
It's a bag of stories. Basically in this, Jeffrey Combs plays HP Lovecraft in another one of the many projects that Jeffrey Combs takes on involving or based on HP Lovecraft. Although I will say, in doing some, research, diligent research, as I often do for the podcast, I read an interview with Jeffrey Combs where he didn't actually he wasn't really into HP Lovecraft before Reanimator.
Well, that is very interesting. I know that now in his life, his whole thing is Edgar Allan Poe, whereas I think it is important that somebody who makes Reanimator isn't that into H.P. Lovecraft, because Reanimator is not a super faithful adaptation in any way. I rewatched it recently, unrelated to this podcast. I rewatched it, and it's fine. He's very good in it.
Yes.
If you are listening, Jeffrey, which we all hope you are. He's really good in it, but I was watching it and it was this thing where it's fine, but you need to see it with a big group of people, with everyone screaming at the special effects and stuff. These were theatre people, and they went off and they made a bunch of really interesting adaptations. They had a Frankenstein that was really out there, that really impressed everybody, and they made a movie. And I feel like that movie, with a theatre, you should see... a crazy theatre play full of special effects and everything, with a big crowd of people screaming and crying and stuff. And you should see the film Reanimator with a big crowd of people. If you're sitting alone in your room watching it on your laptop, it just feels perverse. They put all this effort in and you're just going, hey.
I think that the thing that I think would often stand in the way, and I think you've talked about this as someone who has probably read a lot more H.P. Lovecraft than I have, is that it's probably hard to make a faithful adaptation of a H.P. Lovecraft story.
Yeah, you can't. It doesn't translate particularly well. That was the point of a lot of the ideas that he was coming across, was they were difficult to describe, and there's usually a point in the stories, the more famous H.P. Lovecraft stories, where he kind of says you couldn't describe the horror that you're witnessing.
So I won't.
Yeah. So it kind of, you could depict that, and throughout the history of horror, a lot of the best horror movies owe a lot to Lovecraft. He is hugely influential. Alien is basically, it takes a whole bunch of ideas from it. The Thing is a hugely, Lovecraft inspired story, and the Mouth of Madness that John Carpenter did in the 90s. Like, it's this thing that through the greats of horror films that shows up over and over again. The stories themselves faithfully adapted successfully. The closest I can think is that Nicolas Cage one. What's it called? It came out recently. Color Out of Space.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, they came out as after, over 50 years of people making films or whatever. That's sort of the first one that's come out. And even that, because it tries to depict the colour out of space, which looks kind of purple, they decide. You can't describe it. In the story, it's like you could never describe this colour. It doesn't exist anywhere in nature. It's this, element that touches everything and changes the nature of reality. And in the film, they're like, what if we just made it purple? Yeah,
what if it was kind of purple, but with bits?
When you think about it, purple light doesn't occur a lot in nature, so I guess fine.
Purple's very fun. Purple's zesty. I like it. Reminds me of grape bubblegum. So in Necronomicon Book of the Dead, there's Jeffrey Combs stars in the wraparound device as HP Lovecraft. He's playing Lovecraft, who's visiting this spooky-looking library. The wraparound is directed by Brian Usner, who Combs has worked with a lot. Brian Usner, obviously, he worked on Beyond Reanimator, Bride of Reanimator. He also wrote From Beyond. He also has a cameo in this as HP Lovecraft's driver. Love a little cheeky cameo. The first thing you notice is that in order to play
HP Lovecraft,
Jeffrey Combs is wearing a fake nose and a fake chin. Because if you've ever seen a picture of HP Lovecraft, big old chin. Huge chin.
And it's very important to mention, so anytime you mention H.P. Lovecraft and his incredible influence on horror, you always have to include the other fact that he was a massive racist and a bigot.
Of course.
It's always very important. And it's always interesting about H.P. Lovecraft, who enjoyed writing these florid descriptions of how any kind of monster looked, kind of like a foreign person.
Funny
at the same time had this bulldog underbite that made him instantly very distinctive looking and quite unattractive, weedy little dude.
Whatever you say, Jack, you're the master race.
Whereas in this film, they have given Jeffrey Combs a chin and a nose fake.
Martin Combs.
Yeah, Combs. Yeah. They've given him this, and it makes him look like Bruce Campbell.
Yes.
Strikingly so. Including the scar on the chin, which is where Bruce Campbell's scar is, and isn't on H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, I wonder if that was on purpose, because it's not like Bruce Campbell was slated to play the role or anything.
Well, it ends up tying into the story, because this is very much adventure movie H.P. Lovecraft. This is H.P. Lovecraft by way of Indiana Jones.
Yeah, they wanted him to be a real bit of an action hero, unfortunately, which I don't imagine H.P. Lovecraft was in real life.
He literally never left his house. He was just a big racist sat in a house, talking about how terrifying he thought the outside world was because it was full of foreigners.
Yes.
So he gets to the library. It's a temple run by these monks who are bald, long, foreign-looking men. They kept to that part of the story.
Yep, obviously.
Ambiguous ethnicity. I would assume eunuchs, seeing a bunch of monks in this kind of scenario. Hairless, bald monks.
Is that important to the story?
I feel like it's an important... It would definitely be a detail that you would infer.
Although... as H.P. Lovecraft, Combs says something in the film that I think... I don't know that H.P. Lovecraft ever said this, but he does say, "My work is wrongly construed as fiction by the lesser-minded."
Yes.
Which does sound like something fucking wanky he would say.
Except, very importantly, H.P. Lovecraft did know that he was writing fiction. He wrote for a magazine called Weird Tales, and he came up with spooky stories for them. He was in no way an antiquarian archaeologist investigator.
"I take great pride in presenting fictional possibilities," he says. So he goes to the spooky library. He's looking for, the idea is that he's looking for books, but he's looking for the Necronomicon. He finds this spooky safe, very ostentatious, very foreboding safe. Spooky things start happening in the building once he nicks the book, and then that pretty much just leads us into the first story.
Because he sits down and starts to read through the book, gets his pen and paper out to write stories. that are written in the book. That's not quite clear.
Yeah. Is that Necronomicon the same Necronomicon from Evil Dead? Because the Evil Dead Necronomicon seems to have a lot less fiction in it and more just like horrible punishments for sinners
Rituals,
and spells.
like spells and things. It is kind of interesting that it sort of... It implies with this book, so H.P. Lovecraft sits down, starts reading it, and this brings out the 3 stories that we then watch in the film.
Which are H.P. Lovecraft stories.
Yeah, which are all H.P. Lovecraft stories, but it's not clear, like, are they written in the book? Because as we go into the stories, some of them are set in the modern day, as in the contemporary 1993.
Yeah.
Some of them are set in the 1970s. Some of them, the first one is a period piece, and it's not really clear. But I kind of liked that. I liked the idea that this book is almost an item out of time. So it, like, records things that haven't even happened yet to the letter. I thought that was kind of cool.
I don't think it's necessarily sticking with the social idea of what the Necronomicon is in other films and stories, which is fine.
I'm not sure if we mentioned, but this is H.P. Lovecraft in the 1930s that we're supposed to be watching in the Jeffrey Combs bits.
Yes. So the first story is called The Drowned. It's based on a H.P. Lovecraft story called The Rats in the Walls, which is a great name.
And a great story, and also this story has nothing to do with it. The only way it's an adaptation of The Rats in the Walls is the main character's name is the same. Beyond that, it's its own thing.
That is loose.
Weirdly, this is probably like the closest to a Lovecrafty story when we get into it.
Well, this one is written and directed by Christophe Gans. Do you know anything about him?
He's a French director, a very successful French director. He it's really interesting that he was working on this, but he years later would go on to do a film called Brotherhood of the Wolf, which I would hugely recommend. It's like a kung fu werewolf karate epic that they made in France. It rocks. If you haven't seen it, definitely go see it. It was a huge hit when it came out in like 2001. And then after that, on the strength of that, Gothica with Halle Berry might have been him, though that might have been Matthew Kasovitz, and he definitely got Silent Hill.
Yes, Silent Hill, that's right.
Yeah.
So the first story follows a guy called Edward who inherits this dilapidated, hideous hotel, and we the audience and he both learn of the tragic tales of its unfortunate inhabitants. I love it's got that classic haunted house gothic tale kind of sign off where the woman who's handing over the house to him says, "The only thing living in that hotel is a lot of ugly memories." Edward reads a note left by Jethro Delaporte, who was one of his ancestors. I don't know how far back his ancestor is.
It looks like the 19th century. It looks like that. Sorry, 19th century. Yeah.
Yeah, because he's on a ship. Jethro loses his wife and son in a shipwreck, and in a fit of grief and madness at their funeral, he throws a giant Bible into the fire and decries the cruel God that took his family from him, which is gonna end up bad for him.
But then he gets visited by a fish monster.
Yep.
Who says, "Don't worry, there is someone who's still there for you." I really loved that.
The sea monster in a big hat.
Yeah.
Big fancy like Melbourne Cup hat.
And he gives him the Necronomicon, which, like the fish monster man himself, is like festooned with seaweed and things, and is all very gross.
The fish monster says he is not alone, which you'd think would be comforting. I don't think a sea monster telling me I'm not alone would be comforting. So Jethro does find the Necronomicon, and he decides to bring his family back from the dead. Because what else do you do with the Book of the Dead? Why wouldn't you do that? And he does. But as was said in a different film, sometimes dead is better.
Because they come back and they're weird fish monsters, and they kill and eat Edward.
Jethro.
Yeah, Jethro. Edward's the descendant.
Edward's the descendant.
Yeah.
Well, Jethro. It's not clear. Jethro kills himself.
No, he kills himself because he sees that they've come back as sea monsters or whatever. But okay, so we're aware that the contemporary Edward feels severe guilt because he killed his girlfriend in a car accident.
Yes.
And then we watch this story in which his descendant discovers the Necronomicon. He himself was stricken with grief for the death of his wife and child. He uses the Necronomicon to bring them back. they're all messed up, and he's so distressed by this that he kills himself. Edward reads this and goes, I'll bring my girlfriend back to life.
Yep. There's no way this can possibly go wrong.
I've just read exactly how this will go wrong.
Yep.
Exactly the way, and I'm still going to go ahead and go through with it.
Yep. This fuckhead has been like, oh, that guy just probably didn't do it right. I'll do it good.
It's amazing. Also, I love that, like, it's implied it's this arcane ritual to bring you back from the dead, and it would involve symbols and rites of which, no man could understand. But when Edward performs the rite to bring him back, when both of them perform the rite to bring him back, the symbol that they draw is just a fucking pentagram.
It's a pentagram with a few symbols I didn't recognize in it. And those symbols are also on the safe that H.P. Lovecraft opens in the wraparound.
But it's still the pentagram, like, it's very much, it's such a cliche of these kind of things. Like, you see, and apart from anything else, it's usually used something that they use to summon the devil or whatever.
Yeah, the pentagram seems to be pretty rooted in Satanism, and I don't see H.P. Lovecraft talking a lot about Satanism. It's usually alien sea monsters, things that exist outside of heaven or hell.
Yeah, this is the implication is with H.P. Lovecraft and the source of like this cosmic horror that terrifies people so much is like, no, this isn't the devil. This is so much worse.
Yes.
This is a god that is before time and outside of you. Like you couldn't possibly. It's this nihilistic horror.
The whole other universe you don't even know about, man.
Yeah, you don't just draw like a symbol from Hot Topic on the floor and it shows up. It's supposed to be something special.
Well, as is to be expected, Edward is visited by a reanimated woman. She's all messed up. Thankfully, she turns into a sea monster, but thankfully before she starts going down on him.
She is about to suck his dick.
Yep.
She has the line, and I bet they were real proud of this line, because she's a kind of sea monster looking chick. She gets on top of him and says, I'm tired of just blowing bubbles.
Oh. It's so sick, because then she just unleashes these like mouth tentacles and eye tentacles all over him. And I mean, it's very H.P. Lovecraft, because I'm finding it difficult to describe what happens to him. She
turns in, seems to be this kind of sea monstery thing now that she's returned from the dead.
And something that is in the whole movie of this, great practical effects on the sea monsters.
Oh, good. Like, even if it doesn't look that great, it's still, like with Reanimator, the kind of thing that if you're sitting with friends, everyone, like, screams at. Like, she, like, separates and bits of the body come apart, and it's real flesh. This isn't CGI. You could, like, put your fingers into it.
Yeah, and, like, there's, like, tentacles coming out of her eye sockets and out of her mouth. It's fun, horrible, gory, disgusting. Loved it. So beneath the house, he finds, I guess, a sort of a big daddy sea monster. It's just like...
This is supposed to be like Cthulhu. This is the old god of the deep emerging from the bottom of the mansion.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to know, because Cthulhu always looks different in every iteration you see. I mean, generally he's seen to be sort of like a squid. But, yeah, you have to kind of assume it's like the granddaddy of them all. But thankfully, Edward drops a chandelier on his eyeball, and he goes down.
Yeah,
piss weak.
He kills him, and Edward emerges at the top and views a giant sunset. And according to the Wikipedia article, that he has decided to live again. This is not really communicated by the film. The story kind of just ends.
Yes. I think tonally you're supposed to imagine that it's a positive ending, but I went either way. I could have been like, oh yeah, well obviously his ancestor killed himself at the sight of these unbearable old world gods and sea monsters. So maybe he does too, and it's like a never-ending curse. But
it doesn't really conclude either way. It just kind of stops.
It's however you're feeling.
Yeah, the boss monster's killed, and that's the end of the story.
Yes, and then we go back to the wraparound very briefly for H.P. Lovecraft. After he's finished writing the story, to spot, I guess, something slithering under the floor. The floor is kind of a cage, and there's water underneath, and there's something slapping about in there. Like it may or may not be a sea monster. But he thinks, that's fine, I'll leave it there, and I'll read the next story, which is called The Cold, which is based on Cool Air, the H.P. Lovecraft story. This one is directed by
This one is directed by a Japanese director, Shisuke Kaneko, who like you may not, it's not a household name, but he ended up being like the recipient of, he got all of the Godzilla movies for the 90s in Japan.
He did the Death Note movies as well.
Yeah, he's had a huge career in Japan. He started out making porn, which I did found. Mm-hmm. And but yeah, he went off. And this was both it was directed by him, and it was written by, this adaptation was written by Kazunori Ito. The director could not speak English, which I imagine would have been quite difficult.
Yeah.
When you're making this kind of thing, because it's a very wordy script, this one. It's very...
He wrote the 1995 Ghost in the Shell. Yes, he wrote that. So we meet a reporter, a guy called Dale, who is played by Dennis Christopher, who I didn't really recognise from anything, but I do know that he played Eddie in the original It in 1990. So
he's wonderful. He plays a deadbeat reporter.
Yep.
Oh, the sweat, the desperation pouring off him is lovely.
Real, like, flop sweat scumbag dude. He goes to this old house to interview this shut-in woman regarding a spate of bodies appearing in the area. He seems to think it's connected to her. And the deed of the house is still under the name of an old doctor who appears to have died long ago. So he's like, "Hey lady, this is sus. What's happening here?" So the woman decides to tell him, this man she has just met, the story of her mother, Emily, and the arrival to the house. So then we go to a flashback.
A flashback set in like the 1950s?
Not clear.
I think the diner and everything made me think of the 50s, but a character that shows up later is kind of dressed like the 70s, so maybe it's the 70s.
Nobody is dressed period appropriate. It's really not clear. I tried not to think about it. In the flashback, there's this young woman who goes to rent a room in the house that we're currently in. The owner, who is called Lena, she lives alone except for a mysterious tenant on the 3rd floor. Who could that be? Could be anyone. We find out in like a minute. So the woman decides to take the house. She's eventually visited by her sexually abusive stepfather, and a fight ensues. That's horrible, but thankfully...
It's all written very purple, so like obviously that subject matter is sensitive or whatever, but it's like it's pitched at the level of a Tales from the Crypt episode.
Yes. Thankfully there's nothing terribly graphic or horrible.
It's not meant to linger.
No, it's not meant to be it's not meant to be grim. You're just meant to get the context and then move on. Also, so that you don't sympathise with the stepfather for what happens to him soon. We meet the doctor, the mysterious doctor from the 3rd floor, Dr. Madden, who's played by fucking David Warner. Love him.
Yes.
Love whenever he shows up in stuff.
The revered British actor who then moved to Hollywood and starred in crappy horror films.
He was in Titanic. And In the Mouth of Madness. Oh
yeah, no, he's got a decent filmography, but there's a lot of trash.
That's fine. I love trash.
Like when he started out,
I'm a raccoon for movies.
Well, yeah, this whole exercise is just
you shut your face.
Digging through this shit.
Shut your face.
But yeah, David Warner, it's like when he grew up, the other actors around him were people like John Hurt and Ian McKellen, and like he's that kind of vintage of British actor.
The respected class.
But because of when he went over to America to get work, it's like he has not seen a career like that.
He's very good in this, as he is in most things.
If you want to know who he is, he's the journalist in The Omen who gets beheaded by the big pane of glass. Yep.
He's also Billy Zane's horrible right-hand man in Titanic.
And he's
which is what I usually know him from.
He's the big disabled guy in Straw Dogs. Who the whole ending of Straw Dogs is about.
Yeah, he's one of those that guys. You know, as soon as you may not know him by name, but as soon as you look at him, it's like, oh yeah, I've seen him in a million things.
It's crazy he's not a bad guy in Star Wars at some point, just one of the Imperial officers. They seem to get all of like the old British horror guys.
He could totally do that. Yeah. So the doctor helps her recuperate from the fight that Emily had with her father. He explains that Lena will give her vitamins for her cold. Sounds suspect. He also explains that his skin condition requires a very cold temperature, which is a very vague explanation as to why the house is constantly cold. Unsurprisingly, we find out why soon. Emily cottons onto something when red goo starts leaking out of her ceiling, as you might. So she goes up to see what's going on, goes up to Dr. Madden's room. She just walks right in, by the way. Doesn't knock. Rude. And she sees Lena and Dr. Madden working on her stepfather.
Drilling big holes into his spine.
Yes, it is not clear exactly what they're doing. He's got a lot of holes in him, and there's gooey blood coming around. They're trying to hold him down, so he's still alive, but they're drilling into him, and it looks unpleasant. She faints. There's a whole "no, you're imagining things" thing, which is just that's going to fall apart pretty soon. Another tip-off or another red herring to the audience is when Emily goes to get a job at a diner, and the boss is like, "That Dr. Madden ought to be over 100 years old by now."
And then she goes over to some police that are in the diner, and she sees a sign that says that her stepfather has gone missing. So it wasn't just that he went away after they had a fight; it's that he's disappeared.
So then we then have a scene where Dr. Madden decides to explain what's been happening to him. He gets in this big foggy ice bath, which looks like a tomb, and he explains that a book, spoiler alert, it's Necronomicon again, has taught him about cheating death, reanimating with water. So
he uses spinal fluid. That's why they were drilling into the guy's spine.
Yes, but he uses the example of like water bears, tardigrades.
Yeah,
and how they can survive. They can sort of come back to life when put into water, which I don't.
They're functionally immortal. Yeah, that is a thing about the tardigrades. But it feels like the story, they can't really explain why this guy keeps coming back to life or exactly what he's doing or why it requires spinal fluid. So the doctor sits down and said, tardigrades live forever. Anyway, forget about that.
Yeah, water bears, they're cute, aren't they? Anyway, bye. Yeah, it's not clear what spinal fluid does. I think it's just a creepy idea. Because there's something similar in the third story as well, which we'll get to. And she's so impressed when he reanimates a dead rose that they fuck in the greenhouse.
This is a weird thing about it. So there are plot reasons why they have sex, because there's stuff that happens later on. But I do feel like the actress or someone involved need to say, look, it's not that David Warner is an unattractive man. He looks fine. He's a distinguished older gentleman. But I feel like, particularly this actress, and in this scene, I don't think, flower or not, that she would be all up on that.
Yeah, she's quite young. I don't know how young she's meant to be in the story. She looks young. She looks early 20s. Apart from having, obviously, saved her, there hasn't been any attraction so far.
No. If they cast somebody 10 to 20 years younger, maybe, but unfortunately, understandably, they got excited. It's David Warner, and he's putting in a very good performance, but it's weird that they fuck and distracting.
Yeah, and Lena, the woman who owns a house, is in love with him too. Everyone's in love with David Warner in this. It's a David Warner show.
He's handsome, but it feels like overkill. Also, when they have sex, you see the gross pink liquid, spinal fluid or whatever, leaking out of him. Which is memorable image.
It's never happened to me, but I don't think I'd enjoy it.
No. Getting
a man's leaking spinal fluid onto me while we're having sex.
Just leaking out of his neck, like there's a hole in his neck.
Well, I'm not going to kink shame, but I don't think I'd enjoy it. Lena sees this and she's incredibly mad, obviously, because she's in love with Dr. Madden. She threatens to either kill Emily or herself. And Emily leaves anyway when she realizes that she is pregnant.
So that's why they were fucking, because that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. Is she? So she leaves anyway. I'll let you continue. Because we'll come back to that.
Yeah. Emily then, she does eventually goes back to the house when she realizes she's pregnant, presumably to tell Dr. Madden. And when she walks in, she sees that there's a man that Dr. Madden and Lena are trying to kill.
It's actually the guy from the diner. Who owns the diner?
Oh, the boss, yes, of course. So they want his delicious spinal bits. And in a fit of rage, I guess, Madden knocks a bunch of beakers off his bench, which is always a weird thing for a doctor or a scientist to do.
And he says that the spinal fluid, without the spinal fluid, he's losing all reason.
Yeah, it's like, in any movie that's weird. Like, that's your work. Why are you destroying it? Anyway, it starts a fire, which is unfortunate because that's the last thing he wants
Can't have heat. He needs to keep everything cold, but he's got it.
This is the worst thing that could have happened. That unfortunately causes something that's bad for him, but fun for us as an audience to watch. Because he begins to sort of literally pull himself apart.
Like it's sort of leaking this melting pink goo and the skin pulling back from his bones. I will point out that while watching this, I was actually looking after my 2-month-old daughter, sitting on my knee watching this.
I'm sure she's not. I'm sure she's not taking any of it in.
Said to my partner, they probably don't form memories at this age, right? As David Warner's face splits in half and a screaming skeleton emerges just as the eyeballs deflate.
Yes.
Like I said, for all she knows, people do this. And this is just a normal part of the aging process.
Darling, that's what happens when you hit 70. Lena really wants to kill Emily. She is gung-ho, but she keeps her alive because she's pregnant with
she not before shooting her with a shotgun though, which makes the next thing interesting. So the Emily gets shot with a shotgun. And she says, "No, don't kill me. I'm pregnant." And Lena's like, "What?" We flash forward to the present day.
Yes, where Emily is talking to, where the woman is talking to
the daughter that we're supposed to think is talking to the reporter.
Yeah,
and the reporter says, "I don't think you're the daughter. I think you're Emily. I think you got some kind of disease from him when you had sex, and now you have to be kept cold as a dead body or whatever." The journalist gets this whole chunk of dialogue that's like, why are you doing all this exposition? Yeah. You wouldn't know that. Why did David Warner have a disease?
Yeah.
It's not really... He says something about a skin condition. It's sort of like this dialogue that just needs to justify whatever happens next.
Yeah. So the reporter has a big chunk of dialogue that there's no reason why he should have this theory, and then it turns out to be exactly right. Yeah, the woman reveals that she is Emily, and that she did, I guess, get the same quote-unquote disease.
And she's been keeping herself alive and killing people and stealing their spinal fluid because eventually one day she's going to have the baby that's inside her.
Yes, it is implied that the baby has been inside her for years. That's definitely troubling. Not clear if it's...
It's probably not fine.
No.
Like, she's not aging, so the baby inside her probably isn't developing, so what's...
Not clear. Best not to think about it. Seems upsetting. So the last thing we see, unfortunately, is Lena in not terribly good old age makeup, appearing to steal the reporter's spinal fluid. Poor Dale. Anyway, back to the library. HP Lovecraft keeps hearing strange sounds. One of the library attendants keeps warning him that... one of the library attendants who was warning him about trespassing locks him in the room that he's in. Seems like a dick move, but turns out these guys aren't on his side.
Well, he drops the key into the grate as well. With the
yes. Early on when he first gets in there, he opens the safe and then immediately drops the keys down into the water. And
each time he finishes a story from the book, another level of the safe opens. So it is implied when he's read enough stories, it's going to be open all the way and something's going to come out.
Yes, and he's more and more sort of exhausted and bereft after each story. Third and last story is called Whispers, which is based on The Whisper in the Darkness. And it is, guys, strap in. This fucking... this is about to take off. It's pretty intense. It's also by Brian Yuzna. We open on what you think is going to be a pretty normal story. It's two cops in pursuit. They're Sarah and Paul. It is immediately revealed that they slept together. Sarah basically tells the audience that she's pregnant. And then she's speeding after this guy. Yes. So the cop that's with her is like, "Why are you taking so many risks? I'm sorry that we had sex, but why are you being so crazy? You're going to kill us both. Is this because we had sex? What's going on?" Yeah, and then they flip the car. Not what you want. Paul is dragged away from the accident by someone in pink boots, like pink rubber boots. Yes. And then, so Sarah crawls out and follows the trail of blood to a warehouse, a house. She's looking for Paul, and she finds a man called Harold, who's played by Don Caffer, who I love him in this, and I feel like I've seen him in other things, but I can't I mean, even looking at his IMDb page, I was like, I haven't seen any of these movies. Why does he look so familiar?
Was he in Second City or something? He looks real familiar, like from comedy stuff.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe he's popped up in sketches or something. His most famous film is A Return of the Living Dead in 1985.
Which I don't know if that was definitely produced by Yasmina, but Yasmina did direct Return of the Living Dead 3, so there's a link I can think of.
Yeah, he's great though. He's good at playing a ostensibly normal but underlyingly sinister man. You know, he's got the glasses, his felt hat, a perfectly fine suit, and he mentions someone called the Butcher.
Oh, so the Butcher's taken your partner and he's dragged them into this building that I own, but also I have lost all the keys to.
Yes. I'm just a big dummy. I don't know what I'm doing. And then they meet Daisy or Basie.
It is. I'm pretty sure it's Daisy.
Okay, there's a couple of times where it sounds like he's saying Basie. Anyway,
but yeah, she's a big, sort of friendly Midwestern wife. Big, thick glasses, the kind that just reflect, so you can't really see their eyes.
Yes. It is implied that she's blind, and the three of them go looking for the Butcher.
And she can smell that Sarah's pregnant, and she can also smell that her partner gave it to her. She can also smell that she doesn't want the baby.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot of things to sense about a person.
But these guys are weird. Not only that, but they're living down there in what seems to be even below the basement, in an assembled house. The details of this are amazing. Yeah,
I like to think that they're a swinging couple, maybe outside of their extracurricular activities, which we come to. They go looking for it. Sarah does spot the Necronomicon next to a record player playing an old-timey tune.
And I think that's all the reference we get to it in this, which is set in the modern day. This is not like the others were more period pieces. This is definitely the modern day, modern cops.
Yeah, I mean, a record player playing an old-timey tune when no one's listening to it is a bad sign anyway. The Book of the Dead sitting next to it, you're not in for a good time.
And a weird, normal house underground's pretty freaky too.
Yeah. Daisy is about as subtle as a mallet to the face, and she goes, I bet he didn't tell you the Butcher's an alien. Thanks.
But, I mean, this is the thing, it's Lovecraft, so, alien, like the desexuality community, isn't even half the story.
It could mean so much. It's sort of just a catch-all term at this point. Sarah and Harold, they go sort of exploring.
They keep going, and as they keep going down, they end up in a temple, and they're walking through this a labyrinth with these strange inscriptions on the walls,
carved drawings into the rock of the walls.
Yeah, of sacrifice and ancient humans and things. And this is where it gets interesting because as you point out as you go through the other Lovecraft adaptations, one of the hallmarks of all this stuff is that it tends not to be very faithful. There's not really a lot of Lovecraft feeling in this stuff. But this story particularly, as they get down towards in the writing of the things that Harold starts saying, this actually starts sounding really Lovecrafty.
Yeah.
There's a line he has where it's I guess they decided that God wasn't paying attention anymore, and they decided to back another horse.
Yeah.
He says it for the temple that they're walking into.
Yeah, well, then eventually Daisy sets Sarah on fire and chucks her into a hole screaming, there is no God, so...
Which is not a thing you should do to a pregnant lady, that's real fucked.
No, rude, mean.
So she falls into this big hole filled with bodies.
Steamy skeletons.
Yeah.
So many bodies.
It looks goopy and gross and fucked. It's kind of blue-orange lit, so it's not like you're in pitch blackness, which I like. You can really make out the detail of what you're looking at here.
Yep, there is lots of just wet stuff happening.
She keeps slipping and sliding. This pregnant police woman, she keeps slipping and sliding across all the bodies, and she comes across Paul. But Paul's not okay. No,
Paul's having a rough time. He's shaking and melting. And also half of his body is gone, but like vertically.
The back half is missing.
Yeah. It's sort of like someone decided to wear him like a mask. She also at some point she shoots the wall and green goo starts coming out of the walls. Yeah. Not what you want. I mean, none of this is ideal.
Paul starts attacking her, like flailing at her, the empty, hollow corpse of Paul, while moaning and begging her for help.
Yep. Look, I'm going to say he's done for.
Yeah.
I don't think he's going to get out of that.
To be honest, at this point in the story, it genuinely really gets to a point where they have achieved the Lovecraft thing of, I don't know how to explain to you what happens, really.
Yeah, well, that's exactly how I feel about what happens next, because all I can really say is that Sarah is then beset on by skinless bat creatures.
They're like if the back of your body split open, created a bat creature independent of you, but your brain was kept in a weird glass cage in the tail.
Yeah.
It's something from a Tool video clip. It's fucked.
Yeah, because Paul is still sort of communicating with her via a brain and an eye that is in a sack of a skinless bat creature. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of ideas, and they've decided to go with all of them.
Is this at the point where she passes out, or is that...
This is one of the points where she passes out,
Okay.
because, well, the last thing we hear Harold say is, they got this real sweet tooth for bone marrow, which is similar to the spinal fluid thing in the last one. But then Sarah wakes up in a hospital, and you're like, oh, it was all a dream. Oh, thank God. And it turns out that Harold was just the doctor. And
Yeah, no,
the,
it was all...
the woman who Daisy's that's just her mum.
It's all just Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz waking up. That was all it came from.
Yeah, and you know, who cares? Who cares if Daisy is her mum and starts coming in and talking about how terrible she was for wanting an abortion? It's a very anti-choice message going in this story. I mean, I imagine HP Lovecraft was very anti-choice.
He couldn't understand. He couldn't begin to understand what an abortion was if you told him. He had one girlfriend, and I think she said he didn't really know what was going on.
But unfortunately, it turns out that the hospital is a hallucination, because Daisy has the baby now in her rib sack.
So the place where the brain was on the bat monster, now Daisy has one of those hanging off the bottom of her, but it contains the fetus that she's stolen from Sarah.
Yeah.
Because you see, Sarah was intending to have an abortion, so she had to save the baby from her.
Yep.
And
a subtle message, you would argue.
It is revealed the bat creatures eat they eat bone marrow, like in the thing, with these long proboscis things that look like they're sucking a milkshake out of you.
Well, it looks like a long saw blade coming out of their face. They look like big dumb birds in a sort of post-apocalyptic world. They've got the big saw blade beak that comes in and eats up your marrow. Yum yum yum. That's horrible, and Sarah's not having a great time. But thankfully, we go back to the library.
The last shot of it is Sarah. She's missing 2 legs. She's missing an arm because they're all drinking the bone marrow. And the last line of the whole thing is, "Oh, God damn it, I forgot the keys again." And you see that Sarah's dismembered hand that's been sucked clean in bone marrow still has the keys.
Oh, it's just...
Wow, it is, I feel we cannot, like protagonists in a Lovecraft story, we cannot describe to you the thing we've seen.
Yeah, it is. I mean, even if for some reason you don't want to watch the other 2 stories, I highly recommend watching that. I mean, if only for the practical effects alone. It's a symphony of just things happening.
It's very genuinely like a nightmare. There's just this accelerating, free connecting, narrative that goes on that just keeps getting worse and worse and more nightmarish. And the more the characters act like it's fine, the more upsetting it is.
Yeah, it's immediately apparent that there's no way out for it, and it gets worse from there. So back at the library, Lovecraft is just knackered from these stories. The library attendant tells him to put the book back because the book starts glowing and the sea monster under the floor grabs HP Lovecraft and starts spurting all this green goo on him. But Lovecraft, which I'm sure he did in real life, has one of those knife canes.
Yep, sword stick.
Yeah.
And he pulls out the sword and jams the thing with it. Gets covered in its blood and viscera.
Yeah. I'm sure HP Lovecraft definitely would have done that in real life. For some reason, also HP Lovecraft tears the skin off the library attendant's face.
Because they're not just eunuchs and monks, they're also monsters, which is what sort of H.P. Lovecraft thought was lurking underneath all foreign people's skin.
Yes, because he didn't need to do that. He needed to get away from the library attendant. He could have just punched him in the face. He didn't need to pull the skin off his skull.
Yes.
He wanted to do that. It was a creative choice. So yet another beast comes to devour the library attendant. It comes out of the safe to get the library attendant. It was aiming for HP, didn't get him. Unfortunately, HP Lovecraft lives to write another day, and he goes home with the book. Even though he's warned he'll pay.
Yes,
He'll
there'll be
pay
a
for
cost for
this.
this.
Yeah.
And if there had been a sequel to this, and there very definitely wasn't a sequel, because even with whatever the great margins were on direct-to-video horror films in the early 90s, I don't think they did that great.
No, I did see that there was an estimated budget of $4 million, but I have no idea how much it actually made. And that's the end. He drives off with the book, and presumably went on to live a long and fulfilling life.
Yeah.
Don't read anything about H.P. Lovecraft. Read a story, it's fine, but don't read anything about the guy, or you'll be really bummed out.
And also notice that in a lot of the stories, he just says racist things really casually. It's just,
Yeah.
It's like breathing to him.
So one of my favourite things about doing this is reading the goofs page of a movie's IMDb page, because it really just shows you the kind of nitpicky weirdos from the internet. And I love them.
People who point out that you see a car driving down a road and then turn onto another road, and they have to mention that road doesn't turn onto that road in real life, as if the filmmakers are just slamming their heads like, oh my god, I can't believe we forgot that McClendon Terrace doesn't leave onto David Avenue.
And they send a tearful letter to that reader, saying, "Thank you, Johnny 250. We never would have realised." But in this one, so this is an anachronism apparently in the film, Martin. I don't know if you noticed this, but quote: "In part 2, the setting was around 1970 or early 1971. As the taxi pulls up, yellow dashed road lines are seen on the road. MUTCD introduced these in the summer of 1971 and were rolled out between 72 and 74. On the said road, the modern markings would not have appeared for 2 to 3 years, so therefore should have been white." Did you know that, you fucking idiot?
I think anyone who pointed that out doesn't deserve movies. And doesn't deserve, to have films cater to them. Definitely. They're not
How does that person enjoy a film? Are they just not watching something and being like, that wouldn't happen? Oh, that's wrong. Oh, I can't believe they've done that. Oh, I'm devastated by the inaccuracies in this.
And especially because it's not even a stated time, so we're not even entirely sure.
Yeah,
There's
it doesn't
nothing
say
in the film that implies what time that actually is. That it's supposed to be the 1950s, 1970s, you can tell, in part because of furniture choices and the way it's shot. But that means you can, leave us alone with your road signage quibbles.
Do you want to hear what Jeffrey Combs himself, the man himself, said about making this film?
Yes.
So he said, quote, "Brian Yuzna, who produced Reanimator, was directing the trilogy of horror stories, and the glue that bound them together was this interweaving story of Lovecraft coming to an exotic, mystical library. He wanted me to play Lovecraft. I kind of resisted. I said, I don't look like Lovecraft."
What? You hate money, Jeffrey. What's going on there?
But John Vulich is a great special effects makeup artist. He really got me looking like him as much as he possibly could, with a chin and a nose. I always felt weird portraying Lovecraft in that movie, because Brian, for the project, really wanted Lovecraft to be an Indiana Jones character, and that's not a particularly accurate portrayal of Lovecraft, if you've read any of his biographies. You do what you can with what you've got. End quote. He also says in a different interview that the script altered him into a heroic, self-sacrificing, shy, professional, ragged around the edges puppy dog kind of guy who rises heroically to the occasion, whereas the real Lovecraft was staid and stoic, it seems to me, a little humorless. Which
he was no fun. Yeah,
I can imagine. Yes,
I prefer this version of Lovecraft. It's really fun, and the wraparound segments are a kick. They're real good times.
Yeah.
In this, everything involving him and the attendant. The attendant's so dripping with menace, and Lovecraft being driven by this thing. Obviously, in real life, Lovecraft wouldn't have done anything like this, but that's why I wouldn't watch a movie about that Lovecraft. No. I'm happy to watch one about this particular version. It amazes me that this film kind of you don't hear about. Like, you hear about Reanimator all the time, and you even hear about From Beyond, which also has a lot of crazy effects and things.
Wonderful.
But this, more than From Beyond, is just like you finish it by the time you get through that third story. Like, you feel as upset as HP Lovecraft looks by reading it. Like, I don't know how to explain that to anyone.
Yes, and neither do I, which is why I'm encouraging people to watch this one. There will definitely be some films during this podcast that I will say, look, you can watch it if you're a completionist.
Well, most of them, I imagine.
No. But this one definitely is just worth watching. Like, if you're having a horror movie night and you want something that's big, gory, silly fun, I highly recommend it.
And like, in recommending, I'll be like, I know that first section is a bit of a slog. Get through it, man. It pays off.
Yeah, just stick with it.
Yeah.
So just before we go, how do you rate Jeffrey Combs' performance in this?
Oh, very highly. It's exactly at the right pitch, that Indiana Jones, investigative thing. He completely nails it. He, in truth, didn't need the prosthetics. Like, it sounds like he was very self-conscious somehow. Like, H.P. Lovecraft was an ugly man. Maybe he felt like, I don't look much like this ugly person. But he's really solid in this.
But it's the same when he played in the times, both in the play and in the Masters of Horror episodes where he plays Edgar Allan Poe. He wears prosthetics as well to look more like Edgar Allan Poe. That could be the choice of the director or whoever he's working with, or it could just be like maybe he has chucked that suggestion in because he's like, I feel that I'll be able to do this character better if I look more like it. But either way, I think he does a bang up job in the relatively little time he has on screen. But obviously, he's always a joy to watch. Martin Dunlop, anything to plug that you want to plug?
I got nothing, man. I got a baby. Leave me be.
You've got a funny Twitter.
Yeah, I got @MartinDunlop1. Follow that until it annoys you.
But in the meantime, you can also follow Reanimates on @ReanimatesPod on Instagram and Twitter. I don't have a good sign off yet.
Goodbye, Jeffrey. Is the person listening to it? I assume.
No.
Goodbye, Jeffrey.
Goodbye, Jeffrey, and me.